In this meeting with Prime Minister Johnson for a very simple reason. It is a wake-up call to instill a sense of urgency on the dire state of the climate process ahead of COP26. On Friday, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change issued a report on the national determined contributions, the commitments, of all parties to the Paris Agreement. Based on the present commitments of member states, the world is on a catastrophic pathway to 2.7 degrees of heating, instead of the 1.5 we all agree should be the limit. And science tells us indeed that anything above 1.5 degrees would be a disaster. To limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we need a 45% cut in emissions by 2030, so we can reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. Instead, the commitments made until now by countries imply an increase of 16% in greenhouse gas emissions, not a decrease of 45%, an increase of 16% in greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to 2010 levels. And this means that unless we collectively change course, there is a high risk of failure of COP26. So today I ask leaders to do what is needed to make sure COP26 is a success and that it marks a true turning point. On the way to COP26, the international community needs to deliver on three fronts. First, keeping the 1.5 degree goal within reach, and all the interventions today agreed that 1.5 degree is the limit we should respect. Second, delivering on the promised $100 billion a year for climate action in developing countries. And today, I was happy to see many countries recognizing that it is essential to transform this commitment into a reality. We'll see how it happens. And it is a matter of trust that it is absolutely essential to solve. On third, scaling up funding for adaptation to at least 50% of total public climate finance. We are not yet there, but today a few countries, namely Sweden and Denmark, have announced commitments of 50% or more. And I think that this idea that developing countries are already suffering so much that it's not enough to support them in reduction of emissions. It's necessary to support them in building resilience for their communities, for their infrastructure. I believe that this 50% might gain traction, but we are still not yet there. On mitigation, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that 1.5 degree goal is still in reach. But we need a dramatic improvement in national determined contributions from most countries. I understand the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Developed countries need to take the lead. But it is also essential for several emerging economies to go the extra mile and to effectively contribute to emissions reductions. And we especially need leadership from all G20 members. They represent 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, and there was a consensus in the meeting today that the next G20 meeting will be absolutely essential to guarantee the success of the COP. The bottom line is that we need decisive action now around net zero commitments from all countries and the private sector. And I want to mention one specific challenge: energy. Governments must shift subsidies away from fossil fuels and progressively phase out coal use. If all planned coal power plants become operational, we will not only be clearly about 1.5 degrees, we will be well above 2 degrees. And the Paris targets would go up in smoke. OECD nations need to end coal use by 2030. Developing nations need to follow suit by 2040. And we need coalitions of solidarity between countries that still depend heavily on coal and countries that have the financial and technical resources to support transitions, because it is essential that no more coal power plants are built. On finance, developed nations need to implement their promise to mobilize $100 billion a year for climate action in the developing world from 2021 to 2025. We failed in 2019 and 2020. OECD calculations say we are about $20 billion short, and failure to fulfill this pledge would be a major source of erosion of trust between developed and developing countries. Developed nations need to bridge this gap, and I was encouraged by what I heard today. Increased support from international financial institutions is also crucial. So is the mobilization of assistance from the private sector, both financial and technological. Many asset owners and managers and other financial institutions are now shifting their investments towards a decarbonized, sustainable, and resilient economy. But these private finance flows will not cover the immediate needs of the many countries that need support now or who cannot borrow money because of their debt burden. Again, developed nations need to step up. Finally, on adaptation, we are seeing, indeed, all countries increasingly vulnerable to climate disruption. But the developing world is the least able to adapt and build resilience. As I mentioned, it is very important to reach 50% of climate finance in adaptation. And I've been asking all donors and financiers to commit to that allocation. Overall, my message this morning and to the Conference of Parties in November is that we need decisive action now to avert climate catastrophe. And for that, we need solidarity. Saving these and future generations is a common responsibility. And I'm fully ready to support Prime Minister Johnson and his team in their constant efforts to bring the world back on track. And I thank you.
Michelle Nichols, Reuters.
Thank you, Secretary General. You said last week, and you've also mentioned it again today, that COP26 is at risk of failure. Did today's meeting change your opinion at all? And can you maybe tell us who specifically is not doing enough? And then just a second question on Australia, the US, France, and the UK. They're having quite a spat at the moment over this new security partnership. Do you have a message for them?
Well, that security partnership has nothing to do with climate change and will not contribute to climate action. In relation to the questions that you have asked, there are several dimensions here. Will the developed world finally materialize the $100 billion of annual support to developing countries, and, if possible, more? We are not yet there, but today there were encouraging declarations in this regard. So this is an area where I'm hopeful we will be able to make serious progress in COP in Glasgow. I think there is a growing concern about adaptation. I'm not sure we will get there as strongly as I would like. Where I believe there is still a long way to go is in relation to the reduction of emissions. G20 countries represent 80% of the emissions. And of course, it would make no sense if the developed countries that are already committed to net zero in 2050 would say, well, we have done our job, now it's for developing countries, or especially emerging economies, to do so, or for emerging economies to say, well, the developed countries have not yet provided 100 billion, and as they have polluted more in the past, it's for them to be the biggest effort for us to be able to still go on producing more emissions. I mean, these arguments are no longer valid. Everybody must do their job. Developed countries and emerging economies must be able to contribute, all of them, for the possibility of reaching net zero in 2050 and a very strong reduction of emissions in 2030. And we are not yet there. And I hope that the contacts that are being established by different countries, the US and China, but also with India, with Europe, and with different other key partners, will allow for all these countries to understand that they need to do the maximum without waiting for what the others are doing.
Thank you. The woman in red there, please, on climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. This is Camelia Intekhabi Fard, Chief Editor of the Independent Persian. My question is about Afghanistan. I would like to ask Secretary, talking about the humanitarian issue which has been considered and concentrated, is it any plan also to talk about the political crisis and about the children and the girls aged under 7 years old which are barred to go to school in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Well, our first responsibility as UN present in Afghanistan was, of course, to engage with the Taliban and to put up front a strong commitment for humanitarian aid. And I think it is exactly that commitment and the capacity to deliver on that will give us leverage to be able also to have a positive influence in the matters that you have referred.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to